The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber opened with a sound like thunder rolling across mountains. Ambassador Lisa Martinez walked through those doors knowing that the fate of 20 billion people hung on what happened in the next hour. Her black diplomatic uniform felt heavy against her shoulders as she made her way across the polished floor that stretched for what seemed like miles. Above her head, the dome ceiling showed stars from across the galaxy, each one representing a world that looked to the Council for protection. The Council members sat in their elevated seats arranged in a perfect circle around the chamber floor. Each alien species had their own distinct appearance and their own way of showing displeasure. The Zilani Empire representative sat like a living crystal formation, light bouncing off his faceted skin in patterns that meant nothing to human eyes. The Aquarian delegate floated in her water-filled chamber, her gills moving in quick, angry bursts. The Silicon Collective member looked like a walking computer tower, lights blinking in sequences that probably spelled out mathematical curses. Captain Jake Sullivan stood beside Lisa, his military dress uniform crisp and clean despite the long journey from Earth. His weathered face showed no emotion, but Lisa could see the tension in the way he held his shoulders. Behind them, Admiral Kate Brooks watched from the observation deck, her silver hair catching the light from the star dome above. She had fought in 3 wars to get humanity a seat at this table, and now they were about to lose everything they had worked for. The holographic displays around the chamber showed the horror that was spreading across the Outer Rim territories. Red zones marked where the Void Swarm had already consumed entire star systems. The alien fleet formations that had once protected those worlds were gone, either destroyed or absorbed into the growing darkness. Refugee ships fled toward the inner systems, carrying desperate families who had lost everything to an enemy that seemed to eat starlight itself. Counselor Vextar of the Zilani Empire rose from his crystal throne, his voice ringing through the chamber like music played on broken glass. The human delegation has requested military assistance against the entity known as the Void Swarm. The Council has reviewed this request and finds it lacking in merit. Lisa stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. Honored Counselor, our long-range sensors show the swarm moving toward the core worlds. This threat will not stop at the Rim territories. Every world in the galaxy is at risk. The Aquarian delegate spoke through her translation device, the mechanical voice somehow making her words sound even more cold. Humanity has been part of galactic civilization for less than 200 years. Your species has never faced a threat of this magnitude. You lack the experience and technology to understand what you are asking. Captain Sullivan moved to stand beside Lisa, his combat boots clicking against the polished floor. With respect, Counselor, our scouts have penetrated deeper into swarm territory than any other fleet. We have seen what these creatures can do. We know how they fight and how they feed. Our people are dying out there right now while we debate. The representative from the Kethmari hegemony spoke for the first time, his forearms gesturing in patterns that his translator turned into words. The Council has protected this galaxy for over 10,000 years. We have seen empires rise and fall. We have fought wars that would terrify your species into madness. We know when a battle cannot be won. Admiral Brooks watched from above as the debate continued, her hands gripping the railing of the observation deck. Commander Alex Turner stood beside her, his young face pale as he listened to the aliens dismiss humanity's warnings. Brooks had spent 40 years in space, fighting pirates and negotiating with hostile species. She had never felt as helpless as she did in this moment. The humans speak of sacrifice, Vebindi, said the ethereal consortium representative, its voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They do not understand that true wisdom lies in knowing when to retreat. The Outer Rim can be evacuated. The core worlds can be defended. Some losses are acceptable to preserve the greater whole. Lisa felt anger rising in her throat like bile. Acceptable losses? There are 20 billion people in those systems. Men, women, children who look to the Council for protection. You would abandon them to save yourselves? The Silicon Collective member responded with a series of electronic tones that the translator converted into cold mathematics. Probability of successful defense of Outer Rim territories, 7.3%. Probability of successful defense of core worlds if fleet assets concentrated, 61.8%. The logical choice is clear. The vote came quickly after that. One by one, the Council members cast their decisions into the chamber's central display. The Kethmari hegemony abstained. their representatives citing complex political concerns that meant nothing to the dying worlds on the rim. Every other member voted to deny humanity's request for aid. The massive fleets that could have made the difference began their withdrawal toward the galactic core, leaving the outer territories to face the swarm alone. Lisa stood in the center of the chamber as the alien representatives filed out. Their duty done and their consciences clear. The holographic displays still showed the advancing darkness, still showed the refugee ships fleeing toward a safety that would not last long. Captain Sullivan placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle despite the calluses earned from years of handling weapons. "They're afraid," he said quietly. "They've been the strongest force in the galaxy for so long that they've forgotten how to fight when the odds are against them." Admiral Brooks descended from the observation deck, her footsteps echoing in the now empty chamber. Commander Turner followed close behind, his tablet showing the latest reports from the Rim territories. The news was all bad. More systems going dark, more distress calls that would never be answered, more families torn apart by an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every world it consumed. "Admiral," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what do we do now?" Brooks looked up at the star dome above them, each point of light representing worlds that the Council had just written off as acceptable losses. Her decision had been made the moment the vote was cast. Maybe it had been made even before that, when she first saw the footage of swarm creatures feeding on the light of dying stars. "We go back to our ships," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never backed down from a fight. "We gather every vessel we can find, every pilot who's willing to fly into hell for people they've never met." The chamber's lights began to dim as the automated systems prepared for the next session, whenever that might be. But the four humans remained standing in the growing darkness, their faces lit only by the artificial stars above. "The Council walked away from them," Brooks said, her words carrying across the empty space like a promise. "But we're going to walk straight into the fire." 3 days passed since the Council ships disappeared into hyperspace, leaving behind only empty void, where the greatest fleet in galactic history had once gathered. The human ships remained at the staging point, their crews working around the clock to prepare for what everyone knew would be a suicide mission. Admiral Kate Brooks stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching through the main viewport as the last supply shuttles returned from the abandoned Council depot. The Kepler sector lay 12 hours away at maximum hyperspace speed. Long-range sensors had been sending back readings that made even the most experienced officers shake their heads in disbelief. The void swarm stretched across 3 entire solar systems, a living wall of darkness that seemed to absorb light itself. Biomechanical entities the size of small moons moved through space without any visible means of propulsion, their surfaces rippling like living skin. Dr. Helen Carter bent over her research station, studying the sensor data with the focused intensity of someone who knew that understanding the enemy might be the only thing standing between humanity and extinction. Her fingers moved across the holographic displays, isolating individual swarm entities and trying to make sense of their structure. What she saw defied everything she had learned about biology and physics. "Admiral," she called out, not taking her eyes off her work, "these readings are impossible. The swarm entities are showing biological signatures, but they're also displaying technological characteristics. It's like they're machines that grew instead of being built." Commander Alex Turner monitored the tactical display from his station, watching as more swarm entities emerged from the deeper regions of the Kepler sector. Each new contact made the human fleet's chances of survival seem smaller. His hands moved steadily across his controls, updating fleet formations and battle plans that everyone knew were probably worthless against an enemy they didn't understand. "Ma'am, the swarm appears to be moving in perfect coordination," he reported. "No communication signals detected between entities, but they're acting like a single organism. Individual units are changing course and speed without any apparent external command." Captain Jake Sullivan reviewed the evacuation reports from his command station. 8,000 civilians were trapped on the mining colonies of Kepler 442b, a rocky world that had been home to 3 generations of families who had built their lives extracting rare minerals from the planet's crust. The colonies had sent their last message 6 hours ago, reporting that swarm scouts had been detected in the outer system. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Phillips coordinated the fleet's communications, his young face tense with concentration as he managed data streams from dozens of ships. The human fleet was smaller than anyone wanted to admit. 43 vessels of various sizes and capabilities, crewed by volunteers who had signed up knowing they would probably never see Earth again. Most of the ships were converted civilian vessels, cargo haulers and passenger liners hastily fitted with military-grade shields and weapons. "Fleet status report," Admiral Brooks called out, her voice carrying the calm authority that had made her a legend among human space forces. "All ships report ready for hyperspace jump," Phillips responded. "Battle Group Alpha consists of 12 heavy cruisers and destroyers. Battle Group Beta has 15 frigates and corvettes. Battle Group Delta is our evacuation force, 16 transport ships with military escort." Captain Nina Foster commanded the destroyer UES Vigilant, one of the few purpose-built warships in the human fleet. Her ship had been designed for fighting pirates and hostile alien raiders, not for facing an enemy that could consume entire star systems. She stood on her bridge reviewing the tactical data, knowing that her weapons and shields were designed for conventional warfare against enemies that followed the same rules of physics that humanity understood. "Captain," her weapons officer reported, "we're detecting energy signatures from the swarm entities that are off our scale. Whatever they're using for power, it's more advanced than anything in the Council databases." The hyperspace jump began at 800 hours Galactic Standard Time. One by one, the human ships disappeared into the twisted spacetime that allowed faster-than-light travel. For 6 hours they traveled through the strange dimension, where distance had no meaning and time moved differently. The crews used the journey time to make final preparations, checking weapon systems and reviewing evacuation procedures that had been written in the desperate hours after the Council's abandonment. When the fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler sector, what they found was beyond anything their worst fears had prepared them for. The void swarm filled the space between worlds like a living storm cloud. Individual entities ranged in size from small fighters to massive bioships that dwarfed the largest human vessels. The creatures moved with purpose and intelligence, their dark surfaces absorbing the light from the system's star and leaving shadow where there should have been reflection. Dr. Carter immediately began taking detailed scans, her equipment working at maximum range to gather data on the alien life forms. What she discovered made her blood run cold. "Admiral, the swarm entities are feeding on energy itself. Not just solar radiation, but gravitational fields, electromagnetic emissions, even the quantum fluctuations of empty space. They're turning the fundamental forces of physics into biological mass." The mining colonies on Kepler 442b appeared on the main display as tiny points of light on the planet's dark surface. Long-range communications picked up frantic distress signals from the 8,000 people who had built their lives in the shadow of the planet's massive mining equipment. Families with children, elderly colonists who had spent decades working the mines, and young people who had never known any other world. "They're requesting immediate evacuation," reported Commander Turner. "Swarm scouts have been detected in the upper atmosphere. Colony defense systems are down to 40% power. Admiral Brooks made the decision that would define humanity's role in galactic history. She could retreat and save her fleet, preserving human military capability for a future defense of Earth. She could attempt a limited rescue, trying to save some of the colonists while avoiding direct confrontation with the swarm. Or she could do what the Council had been unwilling to do: risk everything to save people who had no one else to turn to. "Battle Group Delta, begin evacuation procedures immediately," she ordered. "Battle Groups Alpha and Beta, we're going to buy them time. All ships prepare for combat operations against an unknown enemy." Captain Foster opened a fleet-wide communication channel, her voice reaching every human ship in the sector. "All crews, this is Captain Foster of the UES Vigilant. The Council told us we're too young, too weak, and too stupid to make a difference in this fight. Today we prove them wrong. We're going in." The human fleet moved toward the swarm, outnumbered 50 to 1, flying into darkness that had consumed civilizations far older and more advanced than their own. Behind them, the safety of the inner systems beckoned. Ahead, 8,000 people waited for a rescue that the rest of the galaxy had declared impossible. The first swarm entity that attacked the human fleet moved like liquid shadow across the starfield. Captain Nina Foster watched from the bridge of the UES Vigilant as the creature approached her destroyer, its biomechanical surface rippling with patterns that hurt to look at directly. The thing was 3 times the size of her ship and moved without any visible engines or propulsion system. defying the basic laws of physics that human technology relied upon. "Target locked," reported her weapons officer, Lieutenant Bobby Chen. His hands moved across the firing controls with practiced precision, years of training taking over when rational thought failed. "Plasma cannons charged and ready. Fire," Foster ordered, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her chest like a cold hand. The plasma bolt struck the swarm entity dead center, energy weapons that could cut through the heaviest armor plates known to galactic civilization. The beams hit the creature's surface and simply disappeared, absorbed into the living darkness without causing any visible damage. The entity continued its approach, unharmed and apparently uninterested in the human attack. Across the battle zone, other human ships were learning the same terrible lesson. Energy weapons that had served humanity well in conflicts with pirates and hostile aliens were useless against an enemy that fed on energy itself. The swarm creatures moved through the human formations like predators stalking prey, their alien intelligence studying these new opponents with the patience of something that had existed for millions of years. Admiral Brooks watched the tactical display on the UES Defiance as her fleet's energy weapons proved ineffective against the approaching swarm entities. The creatures were moving closer to the evacuation ships, and time was running out for the 8,000 civilians on Kepler 442b. She turned to Commander Alex Turner, her mind racing through tactical options that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion. "Turner, what do we have besides energy weapons?" The young commander consulted his tactical database, his fingers moving quickly across the holographic controls. "Ma'am, we have kinetic projectiles on some ships, railguns, missile systems, and the old-style mass drivers that we use for mining operations." Dr. Helen Carter looked up from her research station, her face pale, but her voice excited. "Admiral, I'm detecting something strange. The swarm entities are trying to interface with our computer systems, but they can't penetrate our quantum encryption. It's like they expect our technology to be more organized, more logical than it actually is." Chief Engineer Tony Miller's voice crackled over the communication system from the UES Hammer, one of the few ships in the fleet equipped with military-grade railguns. "Admiral, requesting permission to try kinetic weapons. These things might eat energy, but let's see how they handle good old-fashioned chunks of metal moving at high velocity." Brooks gave the authorization, and the UES Hammer opened fire with its railgun system. The metal projectiles struck the nearest swarm entity with devastating impact, tearing through the creature's biomechanical hull and sending dark fluid streaming into space. The entity writhed in what might have been pain, its movement patterns becoming erratic and confused. "Direct hit," Miller reported, his voice filled with amazement. "The target is damaged and changing course. Whatever these things are, they don't like kinetic weapons." The discovery spread through the human fleet like wildfire. Ships that had been helpless against the swarm suddenly found their mining equipment and construction tools transformed into weapons of war. Cargo haulers used their loading systems to fire chunks of asteroid ore at attacking entities. Passenger liners activated their emergency asteroid defense systems, originally designed to clear debris from shipping lanes. Commander Sam Rodriguez, captain of the converted freighter UES Liberty, devised what would later be called the Phoenix Protocol. His ship's reactor was damaged and leaking radiation, making it a death trap for his crew. Instead of abandoning ship, Rodriguez made a decision that would change the course of the battle. "All hands, this is the captain," he announced over the ship's communication system. "We're going to overload the reactor and ram the largest swarm entity we can find. The electromagnetic pulse should disrupt their coordination systems." The UES Liberty accelerated toward a swarm bioship the size of a small moon, her reactor building toward critical overload. Rodriguez and his crew of volunteers held course until the last possible moment, then ejected in escape pods as their ship collided with the alien creature. The reactor explosion sent electromagnetic energy cascading across the battle zone, and for the first time since the fighting began, the swarm entities stopped moving in perfect coordination. Captain Lucy Hayes, commanding the corvette UES Ranger, saw the opportunity immediately. Her ship was equipped with advanced stealth systems originally designed for reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines. As the swarm creatures struggled to re-establish their coordination, Hayes implemented what she called Ghost Squadron tactics. "All stealth-capable ships, follow my lead," she transmitted on a secure channel. "We're going to use the asteroid belt for cover and hit them when they're not expecting it." The human ships disappeared into the debris field that surrounded Kepler 442b, using the metal-rich asteroids to mask their signatures. They moved like phantoms through the rock and ice, striking at individual swarm entities before vanishing back into the maze of floating stone. The aliens had fought conventional space battles for millions of years, but they had never faced an enemy that treated space combat like guerrilla warfare. Dr. Carter continued her analysis of the swarm entities, her research station working at maximum capacity to process the data flowing in from the battle. What she discovered would prove crucial to humanity's survival. "Admiral, the swarm is trying to assimilate our technology, but our quantum encrypted systems are completely incompatible with their biomechanical interfaces. Our computers are too chaotic, too human for them to understand." The evacuation of Kepler 442b proceeded under the cover of the desperate battle raging in space above. Transport ships landed at the mining colonies, loading families and workers as quickly as possible while human warships fought to keep the swarm entities away from the planet's surface. Children who had never seen anything beyond their rocky world found themselves carried into space by strangers who had traveled light years to save them. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Phillips coordinated the evacuation from his station on the UES Defiance, his voice steady as he guided transport ships through the chaos of battle. "Transport 7, you have swarm scouts approaching from your starboard side. Adjust course 15 degrees and increase speed." The battle raged for 18 hours, human ships using every trick and innovation they could devise to hold off an enemy that should have destroyed them in minutes. When the last transport ship lifted off from Kepler 442b, carrying the final group of evacuees, the human fleet had achieved what the Galactic Council had declared impossible. 8,000 civilians were safe, heading toward the inner systems and the promise of new homes far from the advancing darkness. But the cost had been terrible. 30% of the human fleet was gone, their crews having given their lives to prove that some fights were worth dying for. As the surviving ships prepared to withdraw from the Kepler sector, Admiral Brooks received a message from the Galactic Council. The aliens who had abandoned the Outer Rim to its fate now offered their opinion on humanity's first major space battle. "Humanity's reckless actions have only delayed the inevitable," the message read. "The Council regrets the unnecessary loss of life that could have been prevented by accepting the logical course of retreat." Brooks deleted the message without reading it completely and turned her attention to the refugee ships that were already planning new lives in systems that had volunteered to accept them. The galaxy might consider their victory meaningless, but 8,000 people who were still alive would disagree. 6 months passed since the Battle of Kepler's Gate, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Void Swarm continued its relentless advance toward the core worlds, consuming star systems with the same methodical patience it had shown since the beginning. The Council's mighty fleets fell back again and again, their sophisticated weapons and ancient tactics proving useless against an enemy that adapted to every conventional strategy they employed. But something else was spreading through the galaxy alongside the darkness. Hope moved from world to world like a whispered secret, carried by refugees and traitors who had witnessed humanity's impossible stand at Kepler's Gate. The story grew with each telling, becoming legend even as it remained absolutely true. A young species with primitive technology had charged into certain death to save strangers, and somehow they had won. General Patricia King stood in the command center of Firebase Prometheus, a hidden base built into an asteroid in the abandoned neutral zone. The facility had been constructed in secret over the past 5 months, using salvaged materials and volunteer labor from dozens of species that the Council had written off as unimportant. Her weathered face showed the strain of commanding a war that officially did not exist, fought by soldiers who had been declared dead by their own governments. The main display showed tactical information from across the galaxy, data gathered by a network of spies and sympathizers that stretched from the Outer Rim to the Council chambers themselves. Red markers indicated swarm positions, blue showed Council fleet movements, and green represented something new: independent resistance groups that had begun fighting back against both the swarm and the Council's abandonment. Captain Bobby Chen commanded Reaper Squadron, a group of pilots flying ships that had been cobbled together from civilian craft and military surplus. His modified cargo hauler looked nothing like a fighter, but it carried enough firepower to take on swarm biocruisers and the speed to escape when the odds became impossible. He stood before his pilots in the squadron briefing room, their faces young and determined despite the fact that none of them expected to live through the war. "Today marks our 100th mission," Chen said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had led men and women into hell and brought most of them back alive. "The Council fights to preserve their own power. We fight to survive. That's the difference between them and us." The missions launched from Firebase Prometheus were unlike anything in the history of galactic warfare. Human strike teams used guerrilla tactics that the swarm could not predict, hitting supply lines and isolated outposts before disappearing into the void. They carried weapons designed by Dr. Helen Carter's research team, kinetic projectiles and electromagnetic pulse devices that exploited the weaknesses humanity had discovered during their first desperate battle. Commander Lisa Martinez, the former ambassador who had pleaded with the Council for aid, now led intelligence operations from a converted freighter that never stayed in the same system for more than a few days. Her network of contacts included Draknari rebels who had been fighting Council oppression for decades, vegan colonists who remembered when humanity had helped them establish their first settlements, and even Silicon Collective dissidents who questioned their leadership's cold mathematical approach to warfare. "General, we're receiving reports from 17 different resistance cells," Martinez reported during the daily briefing. "The Draknari underground has successfully destroyed 3 swarm outposts using weapons we provided. The free colonies of Vega are requesting tactical advisors for their defensive operations. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a galaxy in rebellion. Species that had been ignored by the Council for centuries suddenly found their voices, inspired by humanity's example of standing up to impossible odds. The Zephyrian mining guilds had declared independence from Council authority. The Outer Rim trading confederations were forming their own defense pacts. Even some of the minor Council member states were quietly providing support to the resistance. Admiral Kate Brooks had established her mobile headquarters aboard the battleship UES Defiance, now heavily modified with stealth technology, and equipped with weapons that existed nowhere in official records. Her fleet moved constantly through hyperspace, striking at swarm formations before retreating to hidden bases scattered across the galaxy. The official reports listed her as missing in action, presumed dead, but her legend grew stronger with each impossible victory. Captain Jake Sullivan led the special operations teams that penetrated deep into swarm territory, gathering intelligence and rescuing survivors from worlds that the Council had written off as lost. His soldiers were volunteers from every human colony, men and women who had given up their old lives to fight for people they would never meet. They moved through space in ships painted black as the void, invisible to sensors and silent as death. The breakthrough came when Sullivan's team discovered the pattern behind the swarm's movements. The creatures were not randomly consuming systems but following ancient hyperspace routes that connected the galaxy's core to its outer edges. Dr. Carter analyzed the data from her laboratory aboard Firebase Prometheus, her research revealing a truth that changed everything they thought they knew about their enemy. "General, the swarm isn't invading," Carter explained to the assembled command staff. "It's responding to something. The consumption patterns follow the same routes that the Council uses for their deep space mining operations. I think we're seeing an immune response from something much larger than individual swarm entities." The implications were staggering. If Carter was right, then the Void Swarm was not an invading force but a natural defense mechanism triggered by the Council's industrial activities in deep space. The ancient civilizations that had built the galactic hyperspace network might have included safeguards against the kind of massive exploitation that the Council had been conducting for thousands of years. General, King studied the star charts that showed swarm movement patterns, overlaid with Council mining operations. The correlation was undeniable. Every major swarm advance had begun near sites where the Council had been extracting resources from dead systems or abandoned worlds. The creatures were following the scars left by 10,000 years of industrial civilization. "If this is true," King said quietly, "then the Council didn't just abandon the Outer Rim, they caused this entire war." The resistance network that had grown around humanity's example now had a purpose beyond simple survival. The encrypted communications that flowed between hidden bases and secret cells carried a new message. The Council's leadership knew what they had awakened and were sacrificing entire populations to protect their own core worlds from the consequences of their Actions Captain Chen's pilots reported increasing success in their raids against swarm outposts. The creature's coordination was breaking down as human tactics spread to other resistance groups. The biomechanical entities that had once moved with perfect unity now showed signs of confusion when faced with the chaotic warfare that humanity had introduced to the galaxy. From her command ship, Admiral Brooks received daily reports of Council fleets retreating from systems that could have been defended. The aliens who had once claimed to protect the galaxy were now focused entirely on preserving their own civilizations, leaving entire species to face the swarm alone. But those species were no longer defenseless. Human advisors taught them to fight like guerrillas. Human engineers provided them with kinetic weapons. Human soldiers showed them that courage could overcome technology. The message that changed everything came through an encrypted channel that bypassed all official communication networks. The sender identified themselves only as Zephyrian, underground, but the information they provided was priceless. The location of the swarm's origin point and the Council's secret plans for containing it, General. King read the message in her private quarters, her hands shaking as she realized what it meant. The war was about to enter its final phase, and humanity would once again be asked to walk into the fire while others fled to safety. But this time they would not be walking alone. The Nexus waited at the center of the galaxy like a wound in space itself. Ancient hyperspace routes converged at this single point, creating gravitational anomalies that had puzzled scientists for thousands of years. Long-range scouts had discovered the truth that the Council had tried to hide. The void swarm originated from a single massive entity that dwelled in the twisted space-time of the galactic core, a creature so old that it remembered when the first stars were born. Admiral Kate Brooks stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance as her fleet approached the Nexus, knowing that every ship under her command was flying toward certain death. The combined human and resistance fleet stretched across space like a river of light. Hundreds of vessels from dozens of species united by a single desperate hope. Draknari fighters flew alongside human destroyers. Vegan frigates escorted Zephyrian mining ships converted into missile platforms. Even some ships bearing Council markings had joined the fleet, their crews having abandoned their post to fight for something larger than political loyalty. Dr. Helen Carter worked frantically at her research station, analyzing the final data that would determine humanity's strategy against an enemy beyond comprehension. The entity at the Nexus existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Its consciousness spread across space-time in ways that made conventional weapons useless. Her discovery would change everything they thought they knew about the nature of the threat. "Admiral," Carter called out, her voice tight with exhaustion and excitement. "The entity isn't malevolent. It's the galaxy's immune system, activated by the Council's deep space mining operations. The swarm entities are antibodies, trying to eliminate what it sees as an infection in the galactic structure." Commander Jake Morrison, now captain of the rebuilt UES Defiance after Brooks had transferred her flag to the massive battleship UES Liberty, studied the tactical displays that showed the impossible scale of their enemy. The entity filled several solar systems, its biomechanical structure pulsing with energy that bent the fundamental laws of physics. Swarm creatures moved around it like blood cells protecting a vital organ. "Ma'am, we're detecting massive gravitational distortions around the entity," Morrison reported. "Space-time itself is unstable in that region. Our navigation systems can't calculate safe approach vectors." General Patricia King commanded the ground forces that would attempt to plant quantum charges at specific points on the entity's surface, assuming any of their ships survived long enough to reach their targets. Her soldiers came from every world that had joined the resistance, veterans of 100 small battles who had volunteered for a mission that no one expected to survive. They carried weapons designed by human engineers and alien scientists working together, devices that could disrupt the entity's neural network if they could be deployed at the right locations. The Council's final message arrived as the combined fleet entered the outer edge of the Nexus. The transmission came from the core worlds where the alien leadership had retreated, their massive fleets arranged in defensive formations around their most important planets. The message was brief and carried the cold authority of beings who had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. The actions of the human-led resistance are a violation of galactic law, the Council declared. The entity cannot be destroyed without causing catastrophic damage to the hyperspace network. The responsible course is strategic withdrawal to defensible positions. The Council disavows any connection to these reckless actions. Admiral Brooks deleted the message without listening to it completely and opened a fleet-wide communication channel. Her voice reached every ship in the massive formation, from the smallest fighter to the converted civilian vessels that had volunteered for the final assault. Behind her words lay the weight of every choice that had brought them to this moment. Every life that had been sacrificed to reach this point. All ships, this is Admiral Brooks, she began, her voice steady, despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. The Council walked away from 20 billion people when they needed help most. Today we either end this threat or die trying. Either way, the galaxy will remember that humanity never surrendered. The entity became visible as the fleet closed the final distance, a living nebula that stretched across space like a dark ocean. Its surface rippled with patterns of light that hurt to look at directly, mathematical sequences that described the fundamental structure of reality itself. Swarm entities emerged from its depths like antibodies responding to an infection, their biomechanical forms moving with purpose and intelligence that had been honed across millions of years. Captain Bobby Chen led the first wave of fighters into the entity's defensive perimeter, his modified cargo hauler somehow keeping pace with purpose-built military craft. The swarm creatures moved to intercept them, their coordination perfect despite the electromagnetic chaos that human tactics had introduced to previous battles. These entities were different, more focused and deadly than anything the Resistance had faced before. "All fighters, this is Chen," he transmitted on the squadron frequency. "Remember what we learned at Kepler's Gate. They can't adapt to pure chaos. Don't follow standard attack patterns. Trust your instincts and keep them guessing." The battle that followed defied description. Ships dove into gravity wells that should have crushed them instantly, their crews accepting certain death to plant quantum charges at the entity's most vulnerable points. The Phoenix Protocol was used on a massive scale, entire squadrons sacrificing themselves to create the electromagnetic chaos needed to disrupt the creature's neural network. Captain Amy Thompson piloted her damaged science vessel straight toward the entity's consciousness, her ship's AI core infected with the chaotic creativity that made human technology incompatible with swarm biomechanics. Her vessel carried the final weapon that Dr. Carter had designed, a computer virus built from human imagination and powered by the random quantum fluctuations that made consciousness possible. The entity's response to human creativity was unlike anything it had experienced in its ancient existence. For millions of years, it had fought against organized, logical opponents who followed predictable patterns of behavior. Humanity brought something new to the galaxy, the ability to embrace chaos and find strength in randomness. The creature's vast intelligence tried to process human thought patterns and found itself overwhelmed by the infinite possibilities that existed in minds that refused to follow logical rules. As Thompson's ship penetrated the entity's consciousness, the virus spread through its neural network like wildfire. The ancient creature felt something it had never experienced before: doubt. The humans showed it that existence could be more than simple survival, that consciousness could choose to risk everything for beings it had never met. In the end, the entity made a choice that surprised everyone. Instead of fighting to the death against an enemy it could not understand, it chose to return to the deep sleep that had lasted for eons before the Council's mining operations had awakened it. The swarm entities dissolved back into cosmic dust, their purpose fulfilled and their creator no longer threatened by the activities that had triggered their creation. 1 year later, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session. The chamber that had once echoed with the voices of 12 species now hosted representatives from hundreds of worlds. Humanity sat at the primary table, no longer as supplicants but as the species that had shown the galaxy what courage meant. Ambassador Lisa Martinez addressed the assembly with words that would be remembered for generations. The old council believed in preservation through isolation. The new council will believe in progress through cooperation. We've seen what happens when the strong abandon the weak. We've also seen what the weak can accomplish when they refuse to surrender. In the Outer Rim territories where the war had begun, new colonies arose from the ashes of the old. Human, Draknari, vegan, and dozens of other species worked together to build something that had never existed before. A galactic community based on mutual aid rather than hierarchical control. The Council had walked away from them when they needed help most, but humans had walked into the fire and emerged carrying light for everyone else.